People keep asking us to make our own case. Well, working with Bitwit Technologies Group, we've now made our own tempered glass and RGB case. The case even comes with a front panel that opens, so it is a hinged front panel, and it's a prototype. There's a fan on it, and so the fan is actually mounted to the front of the glass. We thought this was a rather innovative approach to case design, because most of them, if you look at the cases now, normally the fans are behind the glass, but then you can't really see the fan very well. So we're hoping to work with Noctua to get one of these licensed for the case, and we're going to mount it to the outside. You can actually feel the cool air coming off of it, which is really nice when you're gaming, when the system is just getting really hot, and you can feel the cool air hitting you. It's a prototype. Just work with me here. Before getting to that, this video is brought to you by Synergy, the software that lets you share a keyboard and mouse between multiple systems. If you have limited desk space and multiple computers to command, Synergy removes the need for separate peripherals or a KVM and works as over-the-network software. Use our link below to get 50% off the Home or Pro version with SSL. So this is our case. It's got tempered glass on the side and the top, and we've got RGB elements. So this is our version of the modern case industry. So here's where we get real. This is an address to the case manufacturers, the case PMs, the marketing folks who have some hand on how much cases can cost and what they're sold for. This is addressing all of you. And there are a lot of good trends in the case industry that have come up over the last few years. I remember not long ago when a case review would praise a case for having thumb screws. That was the thing. And if a thumb screw couldn't be unscrewed by your fingers, then, well, that was just bad marketing. It was false. It was not actually a thumb screw. It wasn't a toolless design. But the point is, that was what we would talk about in case reviews. It was a function feature of the case, function focused. And not long after that, you start getting cable management as a big point of praise, where traditionally you'd have, like, the Antec 900 was a hugely popular case, but man, it had awful cable management if you go back and look at it now. But it wasn't really a thing then, and now it is. Manufacturers have improved in that department. They've improved in a lot of things, really, and one of them is just stepping away from all of the unnecessary extras, like those included, for example, the hue that used to be included in the 820. That was eventually removed and turned into a separate unit, because really a case doesn't have that many jobs, and once you start complicating it, it gets worse. It costs more. But now the thing is, as we all know, tempered glass and RGB LEDs, and that's fine too. There's absolutely a place for both of those things. Unfortunately, what's happening is these manufacturers are getting so crazed over checking the tempered glass box and checking the RGB box that we're forgetting basic things like a computer needs to be able to breathe. And this is our mesh mod of the H500P. This is not an attack on the H500P. There are plenty of other cases that have these problems. Lots of them. The BitPhoenix Enso that we saw at Computex and put in our needs work category. That was one of them. The Antec P8. That's another one. Whatever the new Antec one is called that was announced like 3 days ago. That's another one. So, not every case needs to have a mesh front panel. That's not what we're asking for. But there are some design elements that you can use to keep the function of some breathability enough to keep your clocks up on a GPU without turning it into a full mesh panel. And we actually have numbers and data on all of this. So I thought I would kind of compile it into one video to share with the manufacturers so that they can use this as some research or some ammunition internally to make changes. So we've got information on the balance, for example, between mesh and glass and how wide the side skirts of a front panel should be. We have that information. We also have information on, for example, the threshold, the tipping point for when, as you are trying to suppress the noise of a case and clamp down on how much noise comes out of it, you also have to kind of up the RPM on the fans and get louder fans in there potentially to counteract and counterbalance the noise suppression or the noise damping element. So there's a trade-off there, and at some point you pass the threshold where sealing it off isn't going to be better when you have louder fans in there. Also, there are instances that I think in the thermal world that manufacturers these days, being that they are in the case industry and not in GPUs and CPU benchmarking, may not even realize that by putting panels on cases like these and like what we've done here, by doing that, you actually can worsen the FPS of people playing games. Think about that. It's not, so this thermal thing, when I talk about thermals in all these case reviews, it's not just because we're trying to find a point of data to nitpick a case about. It's because there are actual differences to your experience as a user when the temperature is higher of the components in the case. A lot of them. One of them is noise. Noise goes up because you're trying harder to cool everything. GPU fans spin up, case fans spin up. Another one is just simply the power consumption. As heat goes up, you have more power leakage. Another, frame rate and clocks. So let's talk about that one. I'd like to present this idea to the case manufacturers so that everyone is on the same page for what happens when you suffocate a case with a panel that might look good, but could have just added another 1/4 inch to the front side skirt so that it could breathe better. That's really all you need in a lot of cases. But looking at the numbers, we have older data from the Titan XP when we overclocked it by about 120 megahertz. And just for example, in Ghost Recon at 4K, way back when we ran these tests originally, the difference was about 8% in frame rate, going from 60 to 65 FPS average. And when we went to 1440p, the difference was about 9.5%. And that's from a non-overclock to a 100 to 120 megahertz overclock on the GPU. So that particular 1440p instance was 95 to 104. That's about a 9 to 10% gain. But why mention 100 megahertz? Where does that number come from? Why this magical number? Well, if we look at some of our frequency over time plots where, it's like I said, it's a prototype. The frequency over time plots where we have temperature and frequency plotted for the entirety of a case test, what you'll see is that the GPU frequency actually falls. So this is very true for Pascal, where it's ultra sensitive to temperatures. Every 5 degrees Celsius can get you something extra. Vega is going the same direction. AMD is starting to do similar stuff with their version of Boost. So both GPU manufacturers are on board with this idea of effectively pre-overclocking GPUs as high as they can be based on parameters such as temperature and voltage and power. So on the temperature front, you have, for example, hitting close to the throttle values on open face cards that are dual axial fans like the Gaming X that we test cases with, perfectly normal fan to use for a GPU. And when it starts throttling at around 82 to 84 degrees Celsius, what happens is the clock will drop and you can plot it and see about a 100 megahertz decline in, for example, the Antec P8 versus, for example, the H500P with no front panel at all. So I'm picking those two because the Antec P8 was a case that throttled quite a bit, and the Cooler Master one, the H500P, when we took this panel off, obviously it's going to have the best airflow it can. Cases inherently worsen your performance from open air. That's just how it works. But you can do things like directional air, stuff like that. All that notwithstanding, they generally will worsen your performance. So removing the panel and having the best GPU performance we can for that case, we were keeping about 100 megahertz higher clocks than the Antec P8 stock. And so the point of pointing that out is that the difference in buying a case that has a front like, let's say the Silverstone PM01 case, the difference between buying a case like this that breathes and buying a case that's closed off in the front like the Antec P8 or the H500P or the Enso or any number of other cases, the Fantex ones, some of the NZXT cases, everyone's pretty much guilty of this with some cases. But the difference is buying a better case can get you a couple percentage extra performance in terms of frame rate, like between 6 and 10%, depending on what kind of GPU you're using, how much you're dropping clocks, what kind of temperatures you're running, things like that. And yes, you can absolutely counter that. You could increase your GPU fan profile to go at a more aggressive curve, go up to 70%. Sure, that fixes the problem insofar as working around it. But it makes everything louder too. And the real fix would be a case that doesn't suck. So that's what we're trying to get here. And to think that your case purchase can impact your frame rate, just like it's not something that you necessarily think about. Until I saw the data a couple years ago, I didn't think about it either. And I don't know that the case manufacturers necessarily think about that. So here's the thing. Let me give a couple pointers here now that we've gotten some of the hard data out of the way. Let's talk about power leakage. So power leakage, we've gotten the clocks out of the way. That impacts frame rate. On the power front, for every 10-ish degrees Celsius you drop in CPU temperature, you also reduce power consumption by about 4%. This is a somewhat goes to power leakage and power efficiency of the CPU. We found this when testing delidded CPUs. We've consulted with others in the industry. This seems to be a general good rule of thumb. So by running a case, actually we can show data for this too. Let's take our recent NH-U14S air cooler, Noctua air cooler for Threadripper. It's a pretty good one. Let's take that and pit it against the Enermax 240 LickTech liquid cooler. And in that chart, you can see a difference of about 9 degrees Celsius. So that 9 degrees Celsius, if we plot it in terms of the power consumption for each test with a known workload and a known power requirement to complete that workload, we see a difference of about 11 watts. So the Enermax cooler with the Threadripper 1950X at 4 gigahertz, 1.35 volts, consumes about 320 watts CPU load during its average peak for that test. Whereas the Noctua one, it's not much lower, but it's 310, 312, somewhere in there. And some of that comes down to efficiency, how the CPU is, or how the cooler is dealing with the heat, and how efficiently it's getting the heat away from the CPU so that it can continue operating without the additional heat load and the power leakage and things like that. So this is all to say that a 10-degree difference in a case, although it may be a difference between, let's say, 80 and 90 degrees, so a case manufacturer might say, well, who cares? It's outside of throttle territory anyway. Just remember, that can impact a lot of things. On a GPU, 80 to 90 degrees, even 70 to 80 degrees on Pascal will show a difference because it's so sensitive to temperatures. And Vega's kind of going the same way. And then the power difference is just extra on top of all of that. Noise, of course, is a concern too. You increase the fan RPMs. We've got data for this one as well. So there's, I think for back when we did a bunch of Vega testing, we had some PWM versus RPM and noise response charts. And one of them shows the noise level per 10% increase in fan PWM. So you go from 20 to 100%, what's the noise increase? We can show that data, and it's really it's not an insignificant jump in noise levels to go from something like 40% fan speeds to something like 60. You start getting a lot louder when you do that. And that's what case manufacturers are asking you to do, or if I'm addressing the case manufacturers, that's what you are asking us to do, is either through automated curves in the GPU V BIOS or through manual efforts, increasing the fan speeds, thereby increasing the noise levels, thereby making your case look a whole hell of a lot worse once it's in an actual real use case. So that's what we're talking about on the thermal, noise, and power side. Willingly nuking performance by upwards of 10% with the worst cases is insane, and it's clearly not intentional. It's just not well researched, and it's a byproduct of an industry that's trying more to keep up with trends than they are to keep up with things that should be standard, which is a computer that is used for gaming. And I mention that because everyone just so brazenly brandishes all of their cases with the word gaming. A computer used for gaming, if you actually know the audience, you know the people you're trying to sell to, it's going to generate heat. And when you generate heat, you really need something to work with it. So let's talk about some of the solutions here. Obviously, this case we made is patented, so don't copy it. But other than that, you can try things like, for an example, most of these panels, really just spacing them in our testing and, again, in consultation with some of the thermal engineers I actually trust in the industry to design a good product. Generally speaking, in our testing, we find that about a 1-inch gap in the side is enough to compensate for a flat, non-ventilated front. So let's take something like the H440. That case came out with a version 2, H440 Steel, as Newegg calls it, or just H440 version 2. The reason it came out with a version 2, other than a couple of small changes internally, is to increase the breathability in the mesh on, I believe, the top and the front. And that's because they increased the distance a little bit between the chassis and the front, or the back rather, of the front panel. So if you have a panel like this, let's just pretend that the front is closed off. So we're just going to say, maybe they've done something like that, and you have a closed off front panel. A good solution, as we've found, is to take the side, like this one. This is a pretty thick side, so we can take this and cut about a 1-inch hole all the way down. You can add some filtration if you want, Cooler Master, for as much as they screwed up on the H500P, this is a good direction to go. It's just not enough for a whole lot of other reasons that we discussed elsewhere. But you do something like that on the side, that basically solves for any severe throttling issues. And of course, you have to have intelligent fan placement and make sure that makes sense too, especially if you're dealing with all like static pressure variables or negative versus positive airflow, what you want in the case, things like that. But generally speaking, that will help a lot. So an example of a case that's done that well would be the Corsair 600C. It was one of the best thermal performance with our old case bench, and that had a lot of ventilation space on the sides of the front panel, but the front was still a solid piece of plastic. So you achieve both the sleek look that everyone wants now, and also still having a breathable case that actually performs really damn well. And that's because of their fan placement, because of their fans, and it's because of that huge ventilated side of the front panel and the other panels on the case. Another point of consideration is power supply shrouds. So PSU shrouds look good. I mean, they hide all of that cable clutter. Everyone wants that. And there's a reason everyone started doing it after NZXT did I think the H440 was one of the first with it, and later the S340. And of course, they've got competition now from Fantex, Corsair, Bitphoenix, Silverstone, Cooler Master, Antec, everyone else also. So it's obviously an idea that everyone likes, and consumers as well. But keep in mind that anytime you add a power supply shroud to a case, when the video card is within a couple inches of that shroud, the open face cards particularly, they start to increase in their temperatures. So we can show this in some of our reviews for cases where you see CPU temperatures might actually be great. They could be super competitive, but when you've got a shroud in there, the GPU temperatures climb a little bit. It's not always bad because the ventilation can help a lot. The front intakes obviously can be aligned with the fan to help with those problems. But something you can do to help get rid of the heat is when positioning the fan, one, make sure the dead zone of the fan isn't sort of directly in line with where the fan's intake on a GPU, assuming a top PCIe slot mount. And two, get a fan down there to begin with. So you get a fan kind of lower down, maybe between it's prototype, the GPU and the CPU, or just straight across from the GPU. But the hot air needs somewhere to go. And those open face cards obviously just kind of blow it everywhere in the case. So radiative heat off the back of the back plate should more or less be dealt with by any fans cooling the CPU. So we can kind of ignore that, and there's often a rear exhaust that just gets rid of it anyway. So you can cut some mesh holes in the back or use the PCIe slot covers that are ventilated. They have all the holes punched in them. That helps with getting the heat out and away from the video card when it's done cooling itself. Another point to consider, the video card vertical mounts are popular now for good reason. They look good. But the problem with these also is that video card temperatures go up quite a bit when they're not positioned correctly. Two good examples recently would be the Thermaltake View 71, which we found first was the first problem with this that we saw, and the other I think was either the C700P or actually I think it was the H500P as well. And the problem with both of these cases is that the distance between a dual axial faceplate of a card and the glass is often like an inch or less. And with a blower fan, it probably works a bit better. Those slots work really well for open loops. Obviously, that's better, what they're better designed for, because you're not dealing with air. Problem solved. But if it's actually an air cooler, which is what most people use, especially in the cheaper cases that have vertical GPU mounts, keep in mind that spacing further from the glass panel is going to help a hell of a lot, because otherwise all that heat kind of comes off the fans, hits the glass, and just gets trapped in there. So that's another point of consideration that we've noticed recently is a potential cause for concern where the GPU can start heating up to a point of increasing fan RPMs to compensate, or throttling if you've set a more clamped down fan speed curve. So just to reiterate here, a few things. One, you don't need a mesh front to be a good case in our eyes. You don't have to do something like this, although this is one of the better cases. You don't have to do that to be good. And we've demonstrated with other cases in the past, that with cases like Fractal, for instance, Fractal gets a bit warm with the defined C, but Fractal, to their credit, does a pretty good job at balancing between making a case that's fairly closed off and does do that discrete, sleek look that is so popular, while also maintaining some level of breathability that is acceptable and within what you would expect to see in a $100 case. So there are ways to do this sleek look or closed off glass look without killing the performance. And the Define C we liked a lot. There are plenty of other cases similar to it that we've liked a lot. The S340 is one of the cases that needs a rework at some point. Looks like the H700i and 400i, 200i will do that. But that was one where, man, it was a great case, but it does have some thermal concerns. We complained a lot about the S340 Elite and its potential thermal issues, but it's all stuff you can work around as a user because they've at least designed the case in a way that it's got the ventilation there. They're just leaving it up to you to add some fans and fix it. And that's not the best solution, but it's better than not having the ventilation there at all and having no good way to fix it without just raw brute force and high noise. So hopefully some of that data helps the case manufacturers. I bring it up because I know what it's like to have a job that is hyper-focused on something, like designing cases in that instance. And I know that when you have a job like that, you lose sight of what's around you in terms of the rest of the industry and the ecosystem. And losing sight of the rest of the ecosystem means that you may not realize that the clocks on a GPU are so sensitive now that the extra couple degrees can cause a drop that impacts your frame rate. So hopefully that kind of puts that data out there in a more digestible or consumable way for the manufacturers and the marketing people. But yeah, I guess that's really all I've got to say. So hopefully there's some improvement in the case industry in terms of thermals. You know, we've gotten the looks thing down pretty well this year. The last year has been all looks all the time. That's made some progress in a lot of instances. It's time to do a little bit of a pendulum swing back the other direction and find a balance point in the middle and try and do the function aspect of cases, improve the thermals either with fan placement or with just better panel design. And again, this is patent pending, so hands off. Thank you for watching. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. If you like this type of content, you can join us on Discord by doing that, where we talk with the community. Alternatively, store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one. Subscribe for more. You'll want to see what comes after this one, I'm sure. I'll see you all next time.